A religious leader went on national television and demanded that every network, every radio station, and every record store in America remove Madonna from existence. He had the backing of his congregation, the ear of several senators, and the full attention of the national press. He spoke for 45 minutes. He used words like dangerous and immoral and a cancer on the soul of this country. He was certain he had the power to end her career. Madonna's response was one sentence, 10 words. And within 48 hours, 10 million people had heard it, repeated it, printed it on T-shirts, and spray-painted it on walls from New York to Los Angeles. The boycott didn't just fail. It became the greatest promotional campaign in the history of popular music, and it happened entirely by accident. But to understand why that one sentence hit the way it did, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand who Madonna was before she was Madonna, and why powerful men had been trying to silence her long before Reverend Donald Whitmore ever stepped in front of a camera. She grew up in a Catholic household in Bay City, Michigan. Her father was strict, deeply devout, the kind of man who believed that discipline was a form of love. Every Sunday at Mass, every rule at the dinner table, every disapproving look across the living room, it all came from a place of genuine faith. Madonna didn't rebel against that faith so much as she outgrew the container it was offered in. She loved the ritual, the candles, the saints, the iconography. She just refused to accept the part where women were supposed to be quiet. When she arrived in New York at 19 with $37 and a one-way ticket, she was already building something that had no template. She wasn't trying to be provocative for the sake of it. And in 1984, honesty from a woman who looked like Madonna and moved like Madonna and sang the things she sang was considered by a significant portion of the country to be a form of assault. Her second album landed in the fall of 1984 and detonated across American culture like nothing the music industry had seen before. The singles were everywhere. The videos were on constant rotation. Teenage girls were tearing pictures of her out of magazines and taping them to their bedroom walls. And somewhere in the middle of all of that noise, Reverend Donald Whitmore of the National Family Covenant was watching his teenage daughter do the same thing. And he decided that someone had to do something about it. Whitmore was not a fringe figure. He had a congregation of over 60,000 across 14 states. He had a weekly television broadcast that reached an estimated 4 million households every Sunday morning. He had testified before Congress on issues of decency in media. He had the kind of institutional credibility that made network executives take his phone calls. On the morning of October 14, 1984, he sat down in front of the cameras in his broadcast studio in Nashville, Tennessee, adjusted his tie, and delivered what he clearly believed would be a decisive, career-ending denunciation. He called her music a direct attack on the values that hold this nation together. He said her performances were designed to corrupt the minds of children and destabilize the Christian family. He read out a list of television networks, radio stations, and retail chains by name and called on his followers to contact every one of them and demand they stop carrying her music. He had petitions, he had numbers, he had momentum, and when he was finished, he folded his hands on the desk in front of him and looked directly into the camera and said, "This woman needs to understand that America has limits." The segment aired on a Sunday morning and was picked up by 3 national news networks by Sunday afternoon. By Monday, it was the story. Every entertainment journalist in the country was calling Madonna's publicist. Every television booker wanted a response. The record label was in emergency meetings. Her management was drafting careful diplomatic statements designed to calm things down without escalating the conflict. Madonna read every single one of those drafted statements. She put them all in a pile, and then she picked up the phone and called her publicist directly. What she said in that phone call has been recounted by her publicist in multiple interviews over the years. Madonna was calm. Not the forced calm of someone suppressing anger. The genuine calm of someone who has already decided exactly what she's going to do and feels completely at peace with it. She told her publicist to cancel all the carefully worded statements. She said she would handle it herself. When her publicist asked what she was planning to say, Madonna was quiet for a moment, and then she said it. 10 words. She delivered the line to a reporter from the Associated Press the following morning, standing outside her apartment building in New York, wearing sunglasses, holding a cup of coffee, not breaking her stride as she walked to the waiting car. The reporter called after her, "Madonna, what's your response to Reverend Whitmore's boycott?" She turned around, looked directly at him, and said, "I think it's the nicest thing anyone has ever done for me." Then she got in the car. The reporter stood on the sidewalk for a moment, genuinely unsure what had just happened. Then he called his editor. The quote moved on the wire within the hour. By that evening, every major news outlet in the country had run it. By the following morning, it was being discussed on morning television shows, late-night programs, and radio stations in every time zone. The reason it worked so completely, the reason it spread the way it spread, was because it did something that no angry rebuttal, no legal threat, no carefully worded press release could have done. It refused to take the fight seriously. It didn't argue with Whitmore. It didn't defend her music or her character or her choices. It didn't even acknowledge that he had the power to threaten her. It simply transformed his attack into a gift, and in doing so, it made him look exactly like what he was, a man who had underestimated his opponent so completely that his greatest weapon had become her best advertisement. The boycott did not materialize in any meaningful way. A handful of radio stations in the Deep South pulled a few of her songs for about a week. One retail chain in Alabama removed her album from its front display. That was it. The 60,000 congregation members who were supposed to flood networks with phone calls mostly didn't bother because the story had already flipped. Their leader had gone on national television to destroy a pop star, and the pop star had turned his entire effort into a punchline in 10 words and kept walking. But here is where the story gets genuinely complicated, because Reverend Whitmore did not go quietly. Stung by the way the response had landed, embarrassed by the coverage, he came back 2 weeks later with something more personal. He had done research. He had obtained, through sources he never named, stories from people who had known Madonna before she was famous. Stories about the years in New York, the hunger, the floors she had slept on, the things she had done to survive. He stood in front of his congregation on a Sunday morning, and he read those stories aloud, one by one, in a voice designed to convey sorrow rather than cruelty. He said he wasn't sharing these things to hurt her. He said he was sharing them because he wanted people to understand that this was a damaged woman, a woman who had been broken by the world and was now trying to break others. He said she needed prayer, not fame. He said the most dangerous thing about her wasn't her music. It was that young girls looked at her and saw freedom, when what they were actually seeing was a wound that had never healed. The room was silent. His congregation was silent. He had calculated that this approach, more intimate and more compassionate sounding than the original attack, would land differently, would be harder to deflect, would make people see Madonna not as a rebel to be admired, but as a cautionary tale to be pitied. He was wrong again. The transcript of that sermon was leaked to a journalist within days. When it was published, the reaction was not sympathy for Whitmore's concern. The reaction was fury. From women's groups, from journalists, from people who had nothing to do with Madonna's music and no particular opinion about her one way or the other. Because what Whitmore had done, without apparently understanding what he was doing, was stand in a church and use a woman's poverty against her. Use her hunger against her. Use the years she had spent surviving, alone, in a brutal city, as evidence that she was lesser. Madonna's response to the sermon was not a single line this time. It was a performance. 3 weeks after the sermon leaked, she appeared on a nationally televised award show. She wore white. She had reworked one of her most recognizable songs for the occasion, stripping it back, slowing it down, turning what had been a dance track into something that felt, in the context of everything that had happened, like a direct address to everyone in the country who had ever been told that where they came from disqualified them from where they were going. The performance ran for 4.5 minutes. By the time she walked off stage, the audience was on its feet. By the following morning, the clip had been broadcast on every major network. Fan mail came in at a rate her team had never seen before. Sales of her album increased by 31% in the week following the broadcast. Reverend Whitmore gave one more interview about Madonna, about 3 months after the awards show. He said he believed he had done the right thing. He said time would judge both of them. He said he had no regrets. He was asked if he had watched the performance. There was a long pause. He said he had not. He was lying. His daughter told a journalist years later that she had come downstairs late that night and found her father sitting alone in the living room in the dark, watching the clip on the television with no sound. She said she stood in the doorway for a few minutes, and then she went back to bed without saying anything, because she didn't know what to say to a man who had tried to erase someone and was now sitting alone watching that person's light in the dark. Madonna never spoke about Whitmore again after that. Not in interviews, not in her memoirs, not on stage. She had said what she needed to say in 10 words and 4.5 minutes, and she had moved on, because moving on was, at this point, something she had been practicing her entire life. The people who try to stop someone like Madonna never understand the fundamental error they are making. They assume that because they have power, institutional power, moral authority, the backing of large organizations, they are dealing with someone who can be intimidated. They do not understand that the woman they are trying to stop has already survived things that would have ended most careers before they began. That she has already sat on the steps of a church in December and cried until there was nothing left, and then stood up and kept walking. That she has already been told no by people more powerful than any reverend with a television show. That the hunger she carried through New York in 1978 was not a weakness. It was an education. And by the time Donald Whitmore sat down in front of his cameras to destroy her, she had already graduated. She was not a woman who could be boycotted. She was a woman who had already survived disappearing. There is a difference. And she understood that difference in a way that her enemies never did, and probably never will. The 10 words she spoke on that sidewalk in New York in October 1984 are still quoted today. They appear in books about communication strategy, in business school case studies about crisis management, in journalism courses about the power of reframing a narrative. Professors use them as examples of how to disarm an attack without engaging its logic. Coaches use them as templates for responding to public criticism. But the people who study those words as a technique are missing the point. The reason they worked was not because they were clever, though they were. The reason they worked was because she meant them. Every single word. The boycott really was the nicest thing anyone had done for her, because it reminded 10 million people that she existed and gave them a reason to choose a side. And when people are forced to choose a side, and one side is a reverend in a suit demanding silence, and the other side is a woman in sunglasses who won't stop walking, most people, given the choice, will follow the one who keeps moving. She kept moving. She has never stopped. And the man who stood in front of 60,000 people and promised to end her is remembered today, if he is remembered at all, as the man who accidentally made Madonna immortal. If this story hit you differently than you expected, that's exactly how it was supposed to feel. Hit that like button, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, have you ever had someone try to silence you? And what did you do? We read every single one. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the people who try to erase you sometimes end up writing your name in larger letters than you ever could have written it yourself. and ring that notification bell, because the next story we're bringing you will stay with you just as long as this one.